It's now my pleasure to introduce Kathleen Marion Carr, who is joining us today to give the Gina Guy Keynote on government service. The Gina Guy Keynote is an opportunity to honor the memory of Gina Guy and highlight the importance of attorneys serving government in roles at the federal, state, and local levels. Kathleen is a retired field solicitor for the U.S. Department of Interior. She has more than 37 years of federal experience in the energy and environmental legal field. Prior to joining DOI, she worked in the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, where she served as a liaison between the commissioner and the regional offices. Ms. Carr earned her BS in business from the University of Wyoming, followed by her Juris Doctorate from the UW College of Law. Please help me welcome Kathleen Carr.
Oh, good, they found my PowerPoint. You always kind of get worried about these kind of things. So good afternoon. I'm Kathleen Marion Carr, and I wish to thank the conference organizers, and that includes Emily Sorensen, Christina Reed, and Temple Lee Stollinger. Thank you also to the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, the Hobbs School for the Environment and Natural Resources, the College of Law Center for Law and Energy Resources, and in collaboration with the Energy and Natural Resources section of the bar. And this is my first opportunity to be back in Wyoming for a long time, and it's a very impressive group of people, and I am thrilled that I've been able to be here and make your acquaintance. And I'm also pleased I'm here as a representative of Gina Guy and in support of her legacy as a proponent of good public policy. And just so you know, I'm in support of good public policy and good government. Doesn't have to be large government, but good government is very important to all of us. And I hope that I impart that message to everybody here today. So my speech will be in 4 parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work with the Department of Interior. I'm going to touch on Gina Guy's legacy. I'm going to make a digression into one case I worked on that I think you will find most interesting. I'll do a little bit of comparison between BLM Idaho and BLM Wyoming, because I think it just shows both Idaho and Wyoming are a lot alike. But the focus of my speech is going to be on the paradox of growing up as a pioneer family and how my parents and my relatives did not appreciate the cooperative federalism that they were given through the federal government. So I have a lot of cool pictures, and they're historic, some of which are from my family, and I have a lot of them. And I just have to tell you, it was like trying to pick between children which to include and which not to include. So you get the benefit of most all of them. We're just going to breeze through some of them. And then if we have time, I'm going to end on tips to working with or negotiating with the federal government. So I will try and be kind of fast. First, there's a disclaimer. This is my own perspective. The Department of Interior, nor my previous supervisors or any part of the Department of Interior may not agree with any of my views. So, oops, I went one too far. How did I do that? So, when I left the Department of Interior at the end of April, I received just a wonderful letter from the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Idaho. And this was the first time I had ever seen a letter like this to a federal employee. And it was signed by the U.S. Attorney and my colleagues, and they congratulated me on my exemplary public service and on my just dedication and overall success rate as a federal attorney. On the other side of the ledger, I also received an exit interview with the ethics officer, and some of you folks might be able to relate to this. I have an 8-page letter of what I can and cannot do after public service. 8 pages. And the interview was daunting and intimidating and kind of scary. So I may not impart any information to you which is confidential or attorney-client or classified. And I may not speak about my work, and that's what that little paragraph talks about, unless I get permission. So I didn't ask for permission. So we're not really going to talk very much about my work, except for the fact that it's really what's publicly known. I will, if we have time, I'll ask questions, I'll answer some questions. But where does this all come from? When you become a public employee for the federal government, every single person takes an oath of office, and you do solemnly swear and affirm that you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that you will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. So we are not, as public servants, this applies to everybody that is in the merit system. You protect the Constitution. We do not swear allegiance to the president or the administration, but we do work for them. And we will change our position in the government based on who's in office, as long as it's not illegal or unauthorized. And the reason we do this is we have all these laws and regulations that govern our conduct. And when you see things in 18 USC, that's usually the criminal code, and it's another one of those situations you want to avoid doing anything intentional. There's also a 14-point code of general principles, but code of ethics, code of conduct, and that provides the general background and provides everybody in the federal government the background and the knowledge of what the parameters of which you can operate in. And the basic point is you need to be unbiased and fair and nonpartisan. So this is the organizational chart of the Department of Interior. The secretary and the top officials are appointed by the administration. There's about 18 political appointees that come in that are Senate confirmed. That's like the secretary, the assistant secretaries. And there's another 50 or so that are Schedule Cs, but they are also with the administration and help and support the administration. Otherwise, there's 66,026 federal employees. And most of those agencies at the lower part are ones that intersect or work within Wyoming. And I'm going to talk about some of those. The solicitor is up there well, it's on my top right. I think it's on your top left. And that is the chief legal officer for the Department of Interior. And the client is the Secretary of the Interior. So we always are working, even though we may be working with a particular agency, our Secretary of Interior is our client. So at any one time in the Department of Interior, the Solicitor's Office could have 3,000 lawsuits. And Gina Guy was in the Rocky Mountain Regional Solicitor. She was one of the first women graduates of the University of Wyoming College of Law, and she was very accomplished. And she worked on some very hard cases, like the Rocky Flats Arsenal, which was a CERCLA lawsuit that was a $7 billion cleanup. And it also involved natural resource damages. And it actually 2,519 acres were turned into a fish and wildlife refuge. And without Gina's help and support, I don't think it would have happened. Other fellow graduates from the College of Law that some of you all might remember are Tony Sullins. He became the regional solicitor for the Northeast region. Veronica Larvey, she became a hearing officer in Salt Lake City for the Office of Hearings and Appeal of the Department of Interior. And then she works for the State Department. She's a Foreign Service officer. And Clark Miller, who I consider my counterpart, but I'm no longer there, but he is the assistant solicitor for water in Washington, D.C. So to become an attorney with the solicitor's office, there's two ways to do it. You can either do it like I did, go through usajobs.gov. I was given some advice before I went back into the federal government, and the advice I was given is get some litigation experience, get some writing experience, and go east to go west. And I did just that. It's very hard to get a job in the West. You all may know Jeremiah Williamson. I hired him in Boise. So he's one of my attorneys. He's very good. He's exceptional, but that's the kind of caliber and talent that we recruit. And when I had an opening in Boise, I had 400 applicants. And these folks have a lot of great experience, exceptionally talented. So go east to go west, do some litigation experience, do some writing, and you will be very attractive to the department. The other way to go in the door is through the honors program, and there's 6 or 8 spots. You have to apply by the October 1 of the year prior to your graduation, and it's very competitive. So that's a harder way to get in the door. Okay, so then I was in the position down there in the little lower box, and I supervised 12 attorneys, and I went up the ranks to become the field solicitor. I was an attorney for 20 years, and then I became the field solicitor for 13. I had 10 people who report to me, 2 people from other offices occasionally worked on our work, and I would supervise them. And then I had paralegals and other support staff too. But the point is we would have, I think in 2022, we were working on 11 federal court cases. The litigation deadlines are daunting. When I was a baby attorney, I say baby, I was in my 30s, but it was new to me. I worked on the Canadian treaty and implementing the Canadian treaty, and just issues, just order of magnitudes you can't even imagine. So it is very, very worthwhile work, and it's something you just are very fortunate if you're able to be a public servant to do it. So I'm going to talk about my client agencies a little bit, or our client agencies in the Northwest. These were the 5 that we worked with. The Bureau of Reclamation is the premier and largest wholesaler provider of water in the United States. They started out under the reclamation program of 1902, where they would build dams, and then people would come in and settle and would repay the cost of the dam for the irrigation water through the construction repayment part of their contract. So reclamation has over 39 projects in the Northwest region, 59 reservoirs, and a total active capacity of 18 million acre feet, and 2.9 million acres are irrigated. This is the crown jewel in the Northwest. It's Grand Coulee Dam. It's the largest power producer in the whole entire United States. It produces 21 billion kilowatt hours of electricity. It's one of the largest structures ever built. It's 550 feet high and 5,223 feet long. So it's as tall as the tippy top of the flag on the Washington Monument. If you took the concrete in Grand Coulee Dam and you went from Seattle, you could build a highway from Seattle to Miami. The reservoir behind it reaches up 150 miles, basically up to the Canadian border. That picture in the lower bottom is one of 6 turbine generators in the 3rd power plant at Johns Keys. Because I'm going to be talking, oops, forgot that I had all this. These are all the reservoirs in Idaho that supply water to Idaho, because the top left is Jackson Lake, which that water comes into, on the Snake River, comes into Idaho, and I'll take more about it. But there's about, in Idaho total, there's 18 million acre feet of stored water. It's helpful to know what an acre foot of water is. An acre foot of water is 325,851 gallons. But so most of you probably know that fact. If you don't, you should. But if you don't, what you probably don't know is how much does an acre foot weigh? And it is 2,717,589 pounds, or 62 truckloads that are full of 44,000 pounds. And so when you consider that behind Grand Coulee Dam, it has 10 million acre feet. Just think of the amount of pressure of that water. Okay, because I worked on the Snake River Basin adjudication for over 20 years, I put in some pictures of the Snake River from its origin in Wyoming all the way to the Oregon border. Here are some facts about the Snake River Basin. And so you'll ask maybe, what is a general stream adjudication? And it's a lawsuit to inventory the rights of an entire stream system by deciding their nature and extent and priority. What was interesting about the Snake River Basin adjudication was it's a McCarran Act proceeding. And under the McCarran Act, the United States has waived sovereign immunity and allowed us to go into state court to have the state adjudicate our rights, much like your Wind River and all of your water rights were on that, under that adjudication. Oops, sorry, I went too fast. So this was an interesting 20 years because I worked on all of the Federal Reserve rights, went up to the United States Supreme Court on like 4 different issues, to the Idaho Supreme Court first before we could even go to the US Supreme Court on probably 12 different issues. So we litigated in-stream rights, Federal Reserve rights, wild and scenic rights, wilderness rights, So in the end, the final unified decree after 27 years was entered, and it was 275,000 pages long. And the total cost for the state, does not account for the United States cost, was $94 million. Office Aviation Services is one of the other clients that work out of Boise, and they centralized air safety and support because they had all of these accidents and different issues. National Interagency Fire Center. You all might be interested in this. Did you know that there are 62,000 average wildfires a year, and they burn 6.8 million acres? The 2022 budget for the National Interagency Fire Center was $1.1 billion. Wyoming had its worst fire in 1988. It's the Yellowstone National Park fire, burned 800,000 acres. Now, it literally wasn't fought because in a national park or in a wilderness, we let those fires just burn just to mimic Mother Nature, and the snow would eventually put it out. The next biggest wildfire in your history was the Bighorn Fire in 1876, and it was 500,000 acres. The worst overall year of fires in Wyoming was 2012. You all had 1,400 fires across the state of Wyoming. To give you the perspective on the cost of a fire, you know the Mullen Fire in 2020, which was just like what, 28 miles from here? It burned 176,878 acres. That fire cost $42,400,000 to fight. Do you know what Wyoming's share of that was? $800,000. Thank you, federal government. So this is the Bureau of Land Management. They manage 12 million acres of public land. That's surface acres, 37 million acres of subsurface. We talked a little bit about the split estate before, and all of you may be aware of it, but in 1916, under the Stock Raising Homestead Act, Wyoming wanted to have more settlement come in, and other states like it. So the federal government agreed, and they split the states. So you'll know when people settled by whether the split estate stays with the federal government, the subsurface, or if it went with, if they settled earlier and they have the part of the minerals with them when they first settled. So BLM functions on the surface is pretty much managed under the Federal Land Policy Management Act of 1976. And there's 2 significant terms under that: multiple use and sustained yield. And, you know, we could talk about this a lot because we've litigated these things a lot, but it's basically one of the things that Congress described in legislation to BLM is that they wanted BLM to best meet the present and future needs of the American public. So when they manage these lands and resources. So in the back of the mind of BLM when they are managing lands is, what are the needs of the future generation, and are we going to be able to have it for them? These are some of the multiple uses that BLM Idaho manages. Of course, FERC does the power lines for interstate, but they do the permitting. And one of the interesting facts that I thought you guys would be curious about, in Idaho, there are 1.9 million people. That's the population base. And there's 2.1 million cows. So a lot more cows than people. And that is a king salmon. So even though U.S. Geological Survey Idaho was our client, I put in these maps that U.S. Geological Survey did for Wyoming because I thought they were interesting. This map that they did was prepared in 1970 and updated in 1990. And U.S. Geological Survey is the nation's largest water, earth, and biological science and civilian mapping agency. Their scientists are some of the best of the best. A map that USGS Idaho did for Idaho was this elevation map. So pretty cool maps. So talking about the split of states a little bit, I wanted to compare Wyoming to BLM. So Wyoming has 18.4 million acres of public land surface that it manages, and in BLM Idaho, it was 12 million. Wyoming BLM manages 42.9 million acres of subsurface, and BLM Idaho manages 37 million. And yellow is the BLM lands, and you can see the other entities who manage other lands. So these are facts about energy in Wyoming. And we know that coal production is dropping. So I'm talking about it first. In 2012, Wyoming produced 374.8 million short tons of coal. 2021, they produced 238.8 million short tons. The royalty on coal is 12.5% of the surface gross value produced, and the state gets half of that. So in 2012, the federal government paid Wyoming $336 million on the coal leased. On oil and gas, it's also, so coal, oil, and gas are all under the 1920 Mineral Leasing Act. And in 2020, all of the states, the Department of Interior paid all the states $1.8 billion for their royalty, and Wyoming's share was $457.4 million. And then you all have minerals that are under the mining law of 1872. Now, I do believe trona and bentonite might be under the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920. I can't really figure that out, but somebody else from the coal industry can explain it to me. But anyway, I would observe that it might be in Wyoming's interest to update the 1872 mining law to 1920 at least, and it would be a very simple fix, so that you could receive the royalties off of the minerals on federal lands like you do for the leasable minerals, because right now you don't, nor does the federal government, because it wasn't built into that law. Okay, so I'm going to switch a little bit now into my history as a Wyomingite and talk about the Wyoming State Constitution. And so when Wyoming became a state in 1890, Wyoming only received 4.2 million acres of land from the United States government. And people say, why is that? When of course there's BLM alone holds 18.4 million, and I don't know what the Federal Forest Service holds, but why wouldn't they have more? And the reason is because there was only 62,550 residents. Plus, you've had on the books 4 acts. You had the Homestead Act of 1862, the Desert Land Entry Act of 1877, Stock Raising Homestead Act of 1916, which, I mean, obviously those is later, and the Carey Act came about in 1894. Carey Act alone gave Wyoming another 1 million acres. But those Desert Land Entry Acts and then the Reclamation Act of 1902 provided the settlement on federal lands for different people. So there was a doorway, there was a way for people to acquire more lands in Wyoming. And I just have to say that Senator Francis E. Warren and Joseph M. Carey, I guess there's some animosity between the two senators, but they were an incredible force of good for the state of Wyoming. The things that they did for Wyoming is pretty incredible. And I can't talk about it because I have many slides I want to show you, but One of the things I wanted to show you, and maybe you don't realize, is about the payments in lieu of taxes. The Department of Interior pays Wyoming, I can't read it from here, but I think it's $34,397 and $34,307,901. And this offsets the losses of property taxes from federal lands being in these counties. So that's a pretty good deal. And that program started in about 1977. Here's the digression. I wanted to tell you about the one case I worked on. It's the Kennewick man. And the Kennewick man was discovered near the city of Kennewick by two college students. They thought they had discovered somebody who had gotten murdered. So they called the police. The police knew enough to call in an expert. The expert called in an anthropologist. And it turns out that this fellow was 9,000 years old. So it was the most fully intact remains that were ever found. But it was found on the ancestral homeland of the tribes, of the Columbia Basin tribes. And they wanted him reburied under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It's called NAGPRA. And of course, the scientists enlisted very, very famous scientists, the Smithsonian scientists, so that they could find out more information about this man. They believed that he shared no traits with the Native American tribes. His closest known, from what little they could glean at the time, was from Polynesian. And they wanted to know, did he walk here through a land bridge, an ice bridge, or was he seafaring? How did he end up in, the Northwest? So it was litigated, of course, because the Department of Interior represented the tribal interests. And so we were trying to help the fellow get reburied, but we lost in the federal district court. And he said, NAGPRA did not apply. We appealed it to the Ninth Circuit. We lost at the Ninth Circuit. So the scientists got to investigate. The court in 2005 allowed the 22 scientists to investigate for 16 days. They found out that because of his arthritis in his right elbow, his knees, and several vertebrae, he spent a lot of time in a boat. So he was obviously seafarer. They determined he was 38 to 45 years old. He was actually buried by somebody because he was buried in this specific position. And what was most interesting is they found in his collagen that he drank glacial meltwater from Alaska. So he had spent time in Alaska. Okay, so that was the end of the story until 2015, until they had an update in technology and whatnot. And then we found the genome data linked him to his descendants in the Colville tribe. So he actually was 2016, Congress introduced legislation to allow him to be buried on somewhere at the tribe's choosing. And that was done in anonymity somewhere, and that's over. So what happened? How did we get to cooperative federalism in Wyoming? It started in 1862 with the first Homestead Act. My great-great-great-grandmother took advantage of this. She ran away at the age of 13. She immigrated to the US, and she came in sometime after 1869 when Wyoming they passed the suffrage right and the right to vote. And so as a suffrage state, Wyoming would allow women to hold property, and you could inherit property and all the like. And then the other side of my family came in through the Desert Land Entry Act of 1877. This is my family. And they were in the Bridger Valley. Thinking about it chokes me up how hard their life was. So they said, their quote was, "The faint of heart never started," because it was just too tough. My grandfather's brother was a photographer, and it's my belief this was taken in the early 1900s of the family dog and cats. Didn't know. My grandfather was a wool grower. They were in the Bridger Valley. The range wars was literally a thing. It was a conflict. It was a problem for them. because there was a conflict between the cows and the sheep and the range, because they only got 640 acres, but the livestock needed many more acres. And so the federal government, they used federal government lands, and it was permissible at that time. They were sheep herders. They lived up in the mountains in the summertime. Here is a wool wagon, 14-horse hitch. Even though they were in Mountain View, the rail station was in Evanston. It would take all day long to go 47 miles. And that happened, the wool wagons were in effect until 1918 when they were substituted out. So this railroad picture is from Lander, because that was where my dad's folks immigrated to. But Union Pacific Railroad was created and funded by the federal government by two acts, 1862 Act and 1864. It wasn't until 1874 it went private. So another act of cooperative federalism in the federal government. So the range wars went on between 1890 and 1909, excuse me, and it really caused conflict, as I said, between the livestock owners. And the rangelands were getting overgrazed. So by 1934, they implemented the Taylor Grazing Act to create a rotation of the lands and how they would be operated. And at that point in time, my family got allotments from the Forest Service up in the Bridger Valley Mountains and up Uinta Mountains, excuse me. But this was the first legislation to organize grazing management on the public domain. But before that happened, the United States, the federal government tried other things to control the monopoly on the lands. And one of the things, because water was always so very important as it is today, it's a scarce resource. This is Cattle Kate, and this was my namesake. I don't know her, no relation, but I was always called Cattle Kate. Her name is Ellen Liddy Watson, and she, like my grandmother, moved here when the Suffrage Act was passed in 1869. She homesteaded. She took I'm thinking 160 acres, but she also was trying to raise cattle. And she had a run-in with the livestock barons next door, Albert Bothwell. He did not want her there. Can you imagine that? Anyway, she was a hardy lady. And so she apparently, because he wouldn't let her have the livestock brands that she wanted so she could have livestock, she decided to go get more water rights. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And he accused her of cattle rustling. And whether or not she was cattle rustling, she might have been. She rounded up some loose stock, but she got lynched. But it was a lot of intimidation in those years. So what did the federal government try to do to create those monopolies of water holes and that intimidation? And they first passed the first public water reserve in 1912. And they had to, because the settlers, the homesteaders couldn't get access to water, nor could the people who were traveling through. So the other thing that was a big deal in my mom's life was electricity. Now, what you would think, well, what does electricity have anything to do with anything? But in the early years in Wyoming, those rural communities didn't have electricity. So I asked my mom, how did you run your Victrola? And I think it was Electrola. She said, we plugged it into a car battery. So, and then you talk about laundry. Laundry was backbreaking. It would take a couple of days, but this machine turned it into 41 minutes. I mean, it was revolutionary to those women to have electricity, and the men too, for that matter. So how did electricity come about, and why is the federal government involved? Because they were the ones that did the federal loan program. Under the Rural Electrification Administration Act in 1935, they gave out 10-year low interest loans for local electric cooperatives. And so the REA was established in Bridger Valley in 1937. That was $5 per member, and there were 275 members, and that cooperative ran 71 miles of line. It would have never happened without the REA, because it just wasn't feasible for the electric companies to do it. And the other big thing that happened was the CCC. They went on from 1931 to 1942, and it's considered one of the best programs of Roosevelt's New Deal. Here's a group of CCCers. And here they are laying trans-mountain telephone cables at Logan Pass on the Continental Divide. Okay, beavers have always been important to ecosystems. Even back then, they knew how important a beaver was to keeping water cool and allowing recharge into the water banks. So building dams, that's my forte. Wyoming just didn't have the technical capability and the order of magnitude to build dams in the 20s, in the teens and the 20s. So reclamation came in, and this is the prime example of cooperative federalism. They set up these projects with the anchor of a dam, and would determine where was feasible for them to run water, and then they would give the farmland to the folks in exchange for repayment of the construction costs of the dam. These are the projects in Wyoming, excuse me. And you'll see the North Platte project is kind of like a little horseshoe. I find that interesting. So the first project, one of the first projects in Wyoming was the North Platte project. And here was a home, but it looks more like a shack. And the anchor for that North Platte project is Pathfinder Dam, which is 47 miles south of Casper and 45 miles north, 40 miles from the nearest railroad. And freight took 3 days to get to there, so it wasn't an option to use concrete. Concrete came in barrels, so they just did that. But the construction costs were $2.45 million, or $2.5 million in 1909, which is about $85 million in today's dollars, and it stores 1,116,000 acre feet of water. Irrigates 200,000 acres. First Jackson Lake Dam was wooden. It failed. Reclamation came back in 1916 and rebuilt it. It stores 847,000 acre feet of water. The water from here is used by your friends over in Idaho. And this is your Idaho farmers building a canal to handle that water. Buffalo Bill Dam, another big dam on the Shoshone project. It was 320 feet high when it was built. It cost $929,658, and it inspired Hoover Dam. And you can see right in the foreground, there is a power plant. When it was built, it was the highest dam in the world. And it was touted along with the Panama Canal as one of the great engineering feats that the United States could build. The power plant, which looks something like this, generated 18 megawatts. It may still, I'm not sure. So these are these were sugar beets, beans, hay. Because Buffalo Bill inspired Hoover Dam, I put these pictures in of Hoover Dam. And Hoover Dam is the largest in pounds. Well, first let me start. It impounds 28.9 million acre feet of water. It has 1,500 megawatts of power, and it provides electricity to Arizona, Southern California, and Nevada. Here is the drilling crew. And this was the first place that hard hats were used. Even though reclamation was seen as the good guys, they did have a big failure in 1976 when the dam failed. Teton Dam, 14 people died, but it did spawn a world-class dam safety program that is used all over the world to make sure dams are safe. Radufa, I'm switching gears. my grandpa on my dad's side, he did some prospecting down in Battle, Wyoming in 1902. This was an ore mine and it went under in 1908 due to fraud. And 1910, Congress formed the Bureau of Mines because of all the fatalities in mines. There was between 1839 to 1914, there were 691 Wyoming people died. And of course, had young children in the mines because they could get down into the seams where the other miners couldn't go. And those 1915, they passed laws to prevent, the federal government passed laws to prevent that from happening. Of course, Bureau of Mines didn't prevent the Kemmer disaster in 1923. So there's only so much you can do. 99 miners died in that accident. I put this Sunrise mine in because it was Rockefeller was a part owner and he was with the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. It was a vertically integrated steel company. But the interesting thing about the Sunrise mine was that it was actually a company town from beginning to end until the Ludlow massacre occurred in Colorado. Here are some postcards my dad got of the Casper minefield in 1919. And of course, oil and gas is under the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920. They pay royalties, the leases go to the highest bidder, there's 10-year leases, there's bonding, and there is environmental compliance. Air pollution. This was Casper in 1922. I don't have any anecdotal evidence about Casper, but my mom went to Salt Lake City quite a bit in the 20s, and she would talk about how bad the coal ash, the fly ash was in the 20s. So it was a real thing. Teapot Dome scandal. I'm sure you all have heard of it, but Albert Fall, he was the Secretary of Interior. He went to prison for 9 months for bribery, and guess who bribed him? Henry Sinclair. So Teapot Dome leases happened in 1922. And 1920 was the Mineral Leasing Act. And my belief is they were trying to get around paying the government royalties. And so there was the under the table payment, even though there was, Albert Fall said, no, it was actually a loan from my friend in California, which it wasn't. They actually proved it came from Henry Sinclair, and Henry Sinclair paid him $304,000, which is essentially like $5 million in today's money. And so it was shown that he was charged with bribery and went to prison. Henry Sinclair, nothing happened to him. So if you're going to bribe the government, don't be in the federal government. They come after you. Okay. So federal highway aid. I don't know that these roads are really part of the federal highway system, but I just thought it was interesting. Wyoming has received from 2004 to 2008, $331,634,600 for highway capital outlay and maintenance. Wolves. I have a particular affinity to wolves. My uncle, Charlie Hanscom, was a game warden in the 40s, and he was in charge of exterminating the wolves in Wyoming. And I remember talking to him personally about wolves, and he said they absolutely have no redeeming value whatsoever. He pounded the table. Like, okay, didn't think it would be a problem for me, didn't think I cared. But when I ended up in the federal government, I ended up we got sued for a wolf hunt on federal lands. The wolves were delisted. And, you can hunt wolves on BLM lands anyway, not in parks, but you can hunt them on federal lands. And so I think my time is up. But anyway, the thought was they wanted to bring back wolves to Yellowstone because there was just not, the songbirds weren't there. They wanted to reduce coyotes, foxes were up, beavers were up, and they just thought it would make a huge difference. So they brought them in under 10J of the ESA, and there's still some debate overall of the overall cascade of benefits, like is it what magnitude, but the trees have come back, the songbirds have come back. They really do disperse the elk. elks. Otherwise, they tend to congregate and chew down all of those trees. And then the beavers came back and the streams are colder and the fish do better. So it's actually anecdotally a benefit, despite what my uncle said. Okay, this is my great grandma. She's the one who came in from Canada. She was married 4 times, had 10 children. Her 3rd child was my great grandmother. And this one, Addie, married John Ramsey, and he was the sheriff of Yellowstone County. And the last slide is how to negotiate with the federal government. That's it.